Games and storytelling have gone hand in hand for many years, to the point where nowadays the story a game tells can be just as important, if not more important to some people than the actual gameplay they experience as they play through a game. However, if you're a fan of retro games, you know that this was not always the case. Games with little to no story were the standard in the industry for several decades, most likely due to the overall lack of memory that games had in those days, and the general climate around games at the time. Now, of course, there were developers that sought to incorporate lengthier stories into their games, like those working on RPGs, but for the most part, retro games fell into two camps when it came to story. Games that lacked a story completely and were centered entirely around gameplay, and games that used motivators. Now you might be wondering, what's a motivator? Well, let me tell you. A motivator is a bare-bones story framework that serves to, well, motivate the player to engage with the game by giving them a reason for doing what they're doing. Contrary to a completely story-driven experience where everything you do always comes back to story progression, in a motivator-based experience, moment-to-moment gameplay is more often than not completely disconnected from the story framework. It's only in a few key sections, usually the beginning and end of the game, where story is associated with what we're doing as the player. With that simple explanation alone, you may still not completely understand what a motivator is, so I'll give you an example of a popular game that used the motivator framework. And that game is Donkey Kong Country. If you've ever played the game, you know that the story here is extremely simple. One day, Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong find out that King K. Rool stole all their bananas, so they go on a quest to get them back. I just described the entire story to you in a single sentence. It's an extremely simple story that's sole purpose is to provide meaning to what we're doing, thus motivating the player by giving them a clear goal. Imagine if instead of having this basic story, you just started the game off without knowing anything. The whole game you'd most likely be wondering what your motivation is, and that can be a little off-putting at times. Sure, the game would still be fun, but giving the player a clear goal like this is never really a bad idea in my opinion. But, like I said before, as games have continued to evolve over the years, developers have largely begun to stray away from the idea of motivators. I'm sure the meetings went something like, why include only a basic story when we can really flesh things out with a much more robust one? And to be fair, many games have greatly benefited from more robust stories, and have gone on to do really well both critically and commercially. I'm in no way denying the growth of the gaming industry in recent years. However, I do believe that motivator-based story frameworks should still have a place in games, and to some degree, they still do. Nintendo, for example, still use motivator-based stories for some of their series, most notably Mario, but as the years go by, it seems like most of their games stray further and further away from a motivator structure. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, depending on who you ask, of course, but my point and the point of this whole video is that I don't think motivators should go extinct. However, they are, at the current juncture, a dying art form. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, but Ak, what makes motivators worth saving from extinction? And that is a very good and timely question. I know I can always count on you guys to have the right questions at the right time. And in my opinion, there are many reasons a motivator framework is still worth using, even in the current gaming landscape. However, for the sake of time, I've come up with the 4 main reasons I think motivators are great and should still have a place in the gaming industry. Number 1 is simplicity. Like I said earlier, there's nothing wrong with a game having a very long and intensive story. In fact, I personally really enjoy story-driven experiences a lot. But there are times where developers can go a bit too far with the detail. Sometimes trimming some of the fat off of the story can make things easier to understand and more enjoyable for the player, and that is where a motivator-based system comes in. The simplicity that this specific type of story brings to the table doesn't really leave much room for confusion, and that can be a great asset to a game in many cases. For example, if your game's audience includes children, it can be better to keep things simple. But aside from kids' games, there are many other genres and games that can benefit from a more simplistic story. Some games just work better when the story doesn't get in the way, and shoehorning a story into one of these games can lead to a less than ideal experience. Going back to my previous example of Mario games, in my opinion, cramming an overly intensive story into a game from that series just wouldn't feel right. Mario games thrive off the simplicity of the story because, at the end of the day, we all know we're there mostly for the gameplay. Having a story that takes a back seat while still being present enough to give the game purpose is the perfect balance for a Mario game in my opinion, and that is why I believe the series should continue to rely on a motivator-based framework. Simplicity, when used correctly, can be a great boon to a game. The second reason I think motivators are great is the charm that often accompanies them. This is of course a very opinionated and circumstantial point, but nevertheless I do believe it to be true. Many of the games that I've played over the years that have used motivator frameworks have left a very charming impression on me. One of my absolute favorite games, Banjo-Kazooie, comes to mind as a particularly charming example. The game doesn't focus on story at all, really. In fact, it's barely mentioned. Get it? Barely. But even though the story plays a very minor role in the grand scheme of the game, I still remember it fondly and very clearly. I believe that is due at least in part to the fact that the game uses a simple motivator as its base. Of course, much of the credit goes to the talented people who worked on the game, but in my opinion, the simple story also played a role in the level of charm and memorability the game's story had. And this opinion is further strengthened by the sheer amount of games featuring motivators that have charmed me in the past. Just going off of the statistics, it seems to be much easier to make a shorter, more simplistic story a very charming one. Number 3 is a very basic reason I think motivators are good for the industry, and that is diversity. In my opinion, based on what I've seen from games in recent years, the trend seems to be that games are becoming more and more like movies. Now that's all fine and good, but if games, especially bigger ones, continue to follow this trend, we will most likely lose some of the diversity the gaming industry is known for. PlayStation's recent releases are a great example of this trend in my opinion. Most of the games PlayStation puts out are third-person story-driven experiences that are trying to get as close to movie quality as possible. The diversity just isn't to the level that I'd personally like to see from a company like PlayStation, who has had some of the most diverse lineups in gaming on a number of their consoles. I understand that they're trying to make the name PlayStation synonymous with quality, but that doesn't mean you need to abandon the idea of making new and different types of games. Diversity is something that brings a wider range of people to your ecosystem, and that is more often than not a great thing in the long run. And making some motivator-based experiences is just another way to diversify your portfolio of games, as well as the industry overall. Last but not least, we have the final reason I don't want motivator-based stories to disappear, and that is platformers. If you didn't know this about me already, I absolutely adore the platformer genre. Be it 2D or 3D, I'm always down for a good platforming experience. But if you hadn't already noticed, platformers are much less popular these days than they were just a few decades or so ago. And honestly, this downward trend can be attributed, at least to some degree, to the general move away from motivator-based experiences, in my opinion. Platformers go hand in hand with motivators. It's by far the genre that benefits the most from a motivator-based system, and therefore utilizes them quite frequently. However, as motivators have become less popular and story-driven experiences have become more popular, we've also seen a fall in the number of platformers developed, especially by big companies. I know this is a very personal matter, but I really enjoy platformers and I don't want to see them go away anytime soon, which also means that I don't want motivators, which are strongly associated with the genre, to go away either. So, the moral of the story is, motivators bring simplicity to games that can benefit from a less intensive story. They are more often than not very charming and memorable when done correctly. The diversity that they can bring to the table could be a great boon to the industry, and I don't want the platformer genre to disappear, so we need to keep motivator-based story frameworks in the gaming industry. However, as games continue to trend towards the two most popular story types right now, absolutely zero story and completely story-driven experiences, my hope that motivator-based games will one day make a resurgence grows smaller and smaller. There is still a slight possibility that we could see a comeback though. Retro games are very popular as of late, and as people start to desire the type of ideas and systems that made up those games more and more, there's a chance that we could see some companies give a motivator structure a shot. I don't really see Sony going that route, but a boy can always dream. Maybe someday. But anyway, thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video, it always means a lot. I know this may not be the most interesting of topics to some people, but I really enjoy this kind of stuff, so I wanted to make a video talking about it. If you have any opinions on motivator-based story frameworks in games, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. Also, I'm not sure if anyone out there noticed, but I did get a new microphone recently, and this will be the first video where I'm using it officially. I did do some testing previously, but there might still be some kinks in the system, so let me know how it sounds on your end. I wasn't really satisfied with the quality of my previous microphone. I had a Blue Yeti, so I upgraded to a full XLR setup here, and hopefully it sounded a little better for you guys. Let me know how it sounds in the comments so I know what to do from here on out, if I should adjust or not. And if you found this video enjoyable, consider giving it a like. It's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Hack out. Motivator-based story frameworks, motivator-based story frameworks, motivator-based story frameworks, motivator-based story frameworks, motivator-based story frameworks. That's 5 times in a row. You guys owe me a Sierra Mist.